Helen sat quietly in her small, dimly lit living room, her gaze resting on the photograph that hung above the mantel. Soft afternoon light filtered through the window, casting gentle shadows across the room. The photograph, framed in polished wood, was of her son, John, wearing his crisp military uniform, his smile full of hope and pride. She had placed it there years ago, a small tribute to his memory, after he passed unexpectedly. She studied the empty chair beside the fireplace, the same one John would sink into whenever he visited. Now, it sat untouched, like a ghostly reminder of his absence. Helen reached for the photo, running her fingers softly over the glass, her heart aching. The years since John's passing had dulled the immediate shock, but left her with a deep, lingering sorrow. Life had grown so quiet since he was gone. The laughter that once filled these walls had faded, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to echo. Placing the picture back, Helen leaned against the worn arm of her favorite chair, letting her eyes drift to the window. Outside, leaves fluttered in the cool autumn breeze, and a lone bird perched on a branch, chirping softly. She felt a pang of loneliness watching it, as if the bird too was searching for something lost. She took a slow breath, her sigh filling the room, mingling with the stillness. Another day, passing like so many others, filled with quiet and longing. The chill of the late afternoon air nipped at Helen's face as she strolled through the park. She wrapped her scarf a bit tighter, pulling it up around her neck, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to seep deep into her bones this time of year. Autumn leaves, orange and brown, crunched beneath her feet as she wandered down the familiar path. It was a route she had walked many times, almost instinctively. But today, as she rounded a bend, a soft, unexpected sound stopped her. Music. It drifted through the air, gentle and melancholic, a quiet melody that seemed to echo through the barren trees. Helen followed the sound, curious, her heart inexplicably drawn to it. She soon spotted a young man seated on a bench beneath an old oak tree, guitar in hand, his head bowed as he played. His fingers moved skillfully over the strings, drawing out a tune that seemed to carry both sadness and beauty. Helen hesitated, watching from a distance. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way he played, something that stirred a memory deep within her. She moved closer, careful not to make a sound, feeling almost as if she were intruding on a private moment. Helen found herself a nearby bench, close enough to hear the music, but far enough to remain unnoticed. She settled in, letting the melody wash over her. The young man continued to play, oblivious to his surroundings, eyes closed as his fingers danced across the strings, each note reverberating with raw emotion. As she listened, a heaviness rose in Helen's chest, the song somehow reaching into the quiet corners of her heart, pulling out pieces of grief she thought she had buried. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, trying to keep her composure, but the music had a way of unlocking the sorrow she carried. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it was John sitting there, playing just for her. She could almost see him, her beloved son, back home for a visit, filling the room with laughter and music. But the vision slipped away as quickly as it had come, leaving her with nothing but the ache of remembrance. The song came to an end, and the young man opened his eyes, looking down at his guitar, as if surprised to find himself holding it. Helen sat still, almost afraid to breathe, not wanting the spell of the music to break. In that moment, as the last note faded into the cool autumn air, she felt a connection, a shared loneliness that crossed the distance between them. Helen stayed seated, her gaze fixed on the young man as he gently rested his guitar on his lap. For a brief moment, he looked around, his eyes distant, as if he were searching for something he'd lost long ago. Helen felt a sudden urge to speak to him, to reach out and tell him that his music had touched her in a way she couldn't quite explain. But she hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. Just then, he looked in her direction, his eyes catching hers. For a second, they simply looked at each other, strangers connected by an unspoken understanding. Helen offered a small, gentle smile, and he returned it, a faint but grateful expression that softened his tired features. Before she could think of what to say, he nodded politely, a quiet acknowledgement, and then turned his attention back to his guitar. As he began to play once more, Helen sat back, letting the melody fill the space between them. She knew nothing about this young man, but somehow his music had become a balm to her loneliness, as if he were speaking a language that needed no words. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Helen finally rose from her seat, her heart a little lighter. She glanced back one last time at the young man beneath the oak tree, feeling an unexpected sense of gratitude. In a way, he had given her a gift, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, connections could still be found. The following week, Helen returned to the park at the same time, her heart carrying a quiet anticipation she hadn't felt in years. As she walked along the familiar path, she scanned the area around the oak tree, hoping to see the young man with the guitar. There he was, seated in the same spot, his head slightly bowed as he tuned his instrument. Helen's heart lifted just a bit. She approached slowly, unsure of what to say or even if she should speak at all. When she reached a nearby bench, she paused, debating whether to sit down or keep walking. But just as she hesitated, he looked up and noticed her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Hi," Helen offered softly, her voice gentle but warm. The young man nodded politely. "Hi?" For a moment, they simply regarded one another in silence. Finally, Helen took a small step closer, emboldened by his welcoming expression. "Your music," she began. "It was beautiful. I don't hear music like that very often. It feels honest." She faltered, surprised at her own words. A hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Thank you," he replied, his voice soft but carrying a warmth that matched his music. "I play to remember. I guess that's why it comes out the way it does." Helen felt a connection, a sense of understanding that seemed to reach beyond words. She nodded, her gaze drifting momentarily to the ground before she spoke again. "We all need a way to remember," she said quietly. The young man looked at her, his eyes softening as if her words had struck a chord. He adjusted the guitar in his lap, then glanced back up at Helen, seeming to measure whether he could trust her with what he was about to say. "My name's Jonah," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I used to play music with my dad, until a few years back. We lost him in an accident. After that," his voice trailed off, his gaze shifting to the distant trees as he gathered his thoughts. "Well, things were never the same." Helen listened intently, her heart aching at his words. She knew too well the weight of losing someone so close. Taking a seat on the bench across from him, she leaned forward, her voice gentle but sincere. "I lost someone too," she shared, her words almost a whisper. "My son. It's been years, but some days it feels as fresh as yesterday." She took a shaky breath, her hand instinctively resting over her heart. "I think that's why your music moved me so much. It sounded like a voice I hadn't heard in a long time." Jonah nodded, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment they simply sat together in that shared silence. Two strangers bound by grief and the quiet understanding of lives altered by loss. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead as Helen and Jonah sat together, both feeling the weight of memories stirred by their conversation. Helen clasped her hands tightly as if grounding herself, and then she looked at Jonah, her eyes soft but resolute. "You know," she said softly, "when I lost my son, there were days I thought I'd drown in the grief. It felt like I'd never be able to breathe again." She paused, her gaze drifting off as she gathered her thoughts. But somehow, life kept moving, whether I wanted it to or not, and I found little ways to keep his memory alive. Jonah listened intently, his expression pensive. Helen's words resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. He had kept his own pain locked away, believing that no one could possibly understand. But here was this kind woman, speaking truths he'd felt in his heart but had never dared to say aloud. "Music was my father's way of connecting with people," Jonah said after a pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "He taught me that every note could carry a story, a feeling. I guess that's why I still play. It's like he's still here in a way." Helen reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jonah's arm. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice steady. "And if your music brings you even a moment of peace, then keep playing. Share that gift with others. Sometimes it's in giving that we find healing." Jonah looked at her, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, a quiet reassurance that maybe, just maybe, his music could help him heal, and in turn, offer that same solace to others. In the crisp autumn afternoons that followed, Helen and Jonah began meeting regularly, forming a quiet routine that neither had anticipated but both came to cherish. They would sit side by side on the familiar bench under the old oak tree, their conversations unfolding naturally, like leaves falling in the gentle breeze. One afternoon, Helen opened up about her life in ways she hadn't done in years. She shared stories of her late husband and of John, her beloved son. She spoke of her son's childhood, his laughter that filled their home, and his love for adventure. Her voice softened as she described the pride she'd felt watching him grow into a strong, compassionate man. Yet, woven into her stories was the quiet ache of loss, the absence that had left a void in her life, no matter how many years had passed. Jonah listened intently, his gaze steady and understanding. For the first time, he felt a connection that went beyond words, a feeling of being understood by someone who, like him, carried memories too painful to speak of most days. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Jonah shared stories of his father. He described how his father's hands guided his on the guitar strings, teaching him not just notes and chords, but the soul of the music. "My dad always said music is how we speak when words can't reach," Jonah murmured, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. Their conversations, at first short and cautious, deepened into something like friendship, a comforting space they created together. They each held a piece of the other's memories, each story shared, building a bridge between their two hearts, two lives bound by love and loss. One chilly afternoon, as they sat quietly together, Helen turned to Jonah with a gentle smile. "You know, I'd like to do something to thank you," she said. "Your music has become something I look forward to. It helps somehow. It reminds me of a warmth I thought I'd lost." Jonah looked at her, surprised and a bit flustered. "Oh, Helen, you don't need to thank me. Really, it's more than enough to have someone listen." But Helen's smile grew, and there was a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Well, I'd still like to. How about this? Would you come over for dinner one night? Just a simple meal. I haven't had anyone to cook for in ages, and I'd love the company." Jonah hesitated, taken aback by her invitation. It had been so long since he'd accepted anyone's kindness, let alone shared a meal in someone's home. The life he led now, moving from place to place, surviving on what little he had taught him not to expect or rely on anyone's generosity. I wouldn't want to trouble you, Helen," he finally replied, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "Nonsense," Helen said, waving away his protest with a warm chuckle. "I'd be honored. It's just one meal, and I'd really enjoy it." She looked at him, her eyes full of sincerity. "Please, Jonah." After a moment, Jonah nodded, a tentative smile forming. "All right," he agreed. "Thank you. I'd like that." And for the first time in a long while, Jonah felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the music. The following evening, Jonah arrived at Helen's modest home just as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. He stood on her doorstep, guitar slung over his shoulder, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and nervousness. Helen opened the door with a warm smile and welcomed him in, her home radiating a quiet coziness that felt almost surreal after his time spent on the road. The smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air, instantly reminding Jonah of his own home from years ago. He took a moment to look around, noticing the small touches that made the house feel alive. The family photos, the soft light of a single lamp casting a warm glow, and a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table. It was a home, and it was clear it had been lovingly tended. "Come sit," Helen said, gesturing toward the dining table. She placed a steaming dish of roast chicken in the center, along with mashed potatoes and greens, all beautifully prepared. "I hope you're hungry," she added with a smile. Jonah couldn't help but smile back, touched by the care she'd put into this meal. "It all looks wonderful, Helen. Thank you. Truly." As they began to eat, their conversation drifted naturally. Helen asked him about the places he'd traveled, the songs he'd written, and the dreams he still carried. Jonah, in turn, asked about her life, her family, and the memories that filled the walls of her home. By the time they'd finished dinner, the initial nervousness had faded, replaced by a sense of comfort and connection. Helen brought out a pot of tea, and they lingered at the table, their stories blending into the quiet warmth of the evening. For a brief moment, both of them felt as though they were no longer alone, two souls finding solace in each other's company, their burdens just a little lighter than before. As the evening drew to a close, Helen glanced over at Jonah, noticing the way he seemed more at ease, the weight of his usual guardedness lifting, if only a little. She reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You know, Jonah," she began softly, "having you here tonight, it's been a blessing. It's been so long since I've had someone to cook for, someone to share a meal with. It almost feels like family." Jonah looked down, moved by her words, a slight smile touching his lips. "I've kept my distance from people for so long, Helen. I didn't expect someone like you to come along." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "You've reminded me that there's still kindness in the world, that there's still hope." Helen gave his arm a gentle squeeze, her own eyes misty. "We all need a little hope, don't we?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it finds us in the unlikeliest places. For me, it's found its way here, with you." They sat in that quiet understanding, feeling the warmth of their new friendship. As Jonah finally rose to leave, he looked at Helen, gratitude shining in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd found something real, a bond, a home, if only temporary, and the stirrings of hope he hadn't dared to feel in so long. As he stepped out into the night, he glanced back at Helen, who waved at him from the doorway, a tender smile on her face. And in that moment, Jonah knew that this connection, this feeling of being cared for, was the beginning of something he'd carry with him, no matter where the road took him next. As the days passed, Helen continued to meet Jonah in the park, their bond growing deeper with each encounter. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Jonah, too, began to open up more freely, sharing stories of his father and his own dreams of performing on a real stage. Helen listened, encouraging him, seeing in him a spark that reminded her of her son. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat together on their familiar bench beneath the oak tree, Helen turned to him, her eyes warm and hopeful. "Jonah," she began, her voice steady yet gentle, "I've been thinking. There's this showcase coming up right here in town, just before Thanksgiving. It's nothing big, just a local event, but I think you should perform. Your music deserves to be heard, and maybe," she hesitated, her voice softening, "maybe it could be a way to share a part of yourself with others, just like you've shared it with me." Jonah's eyes widened, and he looked down, gripping the neck of his guitar. "I don't know, Helen," he murmured, his voice thick with doubt. "It's been so long since I've played for anyone other than a passing stranger. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough?" Helen reached over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, her gaze filled with encouragement. "Jonah, I know it's scary, but I also know how deeply your music has touched me. Every note, every chord, it carries your heart. That's something you can't get wrong. And remember, you wouldn't be doing this alone. I'll be there, cheering you on every step of the way." Jonah met her eyes, searching for reassurance, and in her steady gaze he found a glimmer of courage. The idea of playing in front of others still frightened him, but Helen's unwavering belief in him gave him a reason to try. Taking a deep breath, Jonah nodded, a small but determined smile crossing his face. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." In the days leading up to the showcase, Jonah poured himself into preparing. Each afternoon, he and Helen would meet in the park, where he would practice under her watchful, encouraging eye. She'd sit beside him on the bench, listening closely as he worked through his songs, adjusting a chord here, softening a note there. Her gentle nods and warm smiles gave him a quiet confidence he hadn't felt in years. But as the showcase drew closer, the familiar shadows of doubt crept back into Jonah's mind. One chilly afternoon, as he stumbled over a chord he'd played perfectly the day before, he set his guitar down with a frustrated sigh, pressing his hands over his face. "What if I freeze up, Helen?" he whispered, his voice barely holding back the fear. "What if I get on that stage and forget everything? I don't want to let you down. Or my dad." Helen reached over and placed a comforting hand on his, her touch steady and warm. Jonah, she said softly, you carry your father's memory in every note you play. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to me, not to the audience. This is about sharing what's in your heart. That's all that matters. Jonah took a deep, steadying breath, letting her words sink in. He looked up at Helen, her face full of warmth and unshakable belief. Her encouragement was like a lifeline, pulling him out of the storm of doubt. Thank you, Helen, he said, his voice steadier this time. For everything. She smiled, her eyes shining with quiet pride. You've got this, Jonah. And remember, you're not doing it alone. I'll be right there, cheering for you. Jonah nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to share his music and the memory of his father with the world. As the day of the showcase approached, Helen and Jonah shared more conversations filled with memories and quiet encouragement. One afternoon, while taking a break from practice, they sat in a comfortable silence on their usual bench, watching the last autumn leaves flutter down around them. Helen finally broke the silence, her voice soft. Jonah, I want you to know, you've given me something I didn't even know I needed, she began, her gaze fixed on the distant trees. It's been so long since I felt connected to anyone. You've brought warmth back into my life, and for that, I'm so grateful. Jonah looked at her, touched by her words. Helen, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You gave me the courage to even consider playing again. I thought I was done with music, that it was something I could only keep for myself, but you've shown me it can be more than that. It can be healing. Helen turned to him, her eyes bright with emotion. That's what you're doing, Jonah. Every time you play, you're not just healing yourself, you're giving others a piece of that healing too. And tomorrow, when you get up on that stage, you'll be sharing that gift with so many more. Jonah nodded, a renewed sense of purpose filling his heart. For the first time, he understood that the performance wasn't just for him or even for his father's memory. It was for Helen, for everyone who needed to feel that same hope he'd found, one note at a time. As they rose from the bench to leave, Helen placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Remember, Jonah, she said with a small, reassuring smile, no matter what happens, you've already made a difference, and I'll be there in the front row, proud as ever. Jonah smiled back, feeling the warmth of her words settle within him, and in that moment, he knew he was ready. The evening of the showcase arrived, and a nervous energy filled the air as Jonah walked into the small community center, his guitar case clutched tightly in his hand. People milled about, finding seats and chatting, the gentle hum of conversation underscoring the anticipation of the performances to come. Jonah's heart pounded, each beat echoing louder as he took in the sight of the stage, lit by a single, warm spotlight. Helen found him just before he made his way backstage. She reached for his hand, giving it a firm squeeze, her smile steady and reassuring. Remember, Jonah, she said softly, her voice calm amidst the flurry of activity, you're here to share your heart, not to prove anything. Just let the music speak for you. He took a deep breath, nodding as her words settled over him like a soothing balm. Thank you, Helen, for everything. I wouldn't be here without you. Helen's eyes shone with pride as she let go of his hand. I'll be right there, cheering you on. With one last look, Jonah made his way backstage. As he waited for his turn, he could feel the familiar twinge of fear, that old uncertainty threatening to rise. But in the quiet moments before his name was called, he remembered Helen's encouragement, her belief in him. He took another deep breath, grounding himself, and when the announcer finally called his name, he stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. The lights dimmed slightly, and the room fell silent. Jonah took a seat on the lone stool under the spotlight, positioning his guitar as he glanced out over the crowd. He caught sight of Helen, sitting in the front row, her gaze filled with quiet strength, her smile radiating warmth and encouragement. Drawing one last deep breath, Jonah closed his eyes and began to play, letting his fingers find the familiar chords, letting the music flow. The song, one he'd written in memory of his father, filled the room with a tender, haunting melody. Each note carried the weight of his journey, of loss, of loneliness, and finally, of hope. As Jonah's fingers moved across the guitar strings, He poured himself into the song, letting the music carry every unspoken feeling he'd held inside for so long. The melody drifted softly through the room, delicate and vulnerable, like a whisper from the past. He could feel his father's presence in each note, his hands guiding Jonah's, reminding him of the love they'd shared and the legacy he was carrying forward. His voice, quiet at first, found its strength as he began to sing the lyrics he'd written, words that spoke of love and loss, of the pain of saying goodbye, and the hope of holding on to memories. The audience sat transfixed, the room so silent that even the smallest breath seemed to echo. When he glanced toward the front row, Jonah saw Helen, her eyes shining with tears, her gaze locked onto him, as if his song had reached into her heart and touched something she'd thought she'd lost. Her presence grounded him, anchoring him in the moment, reminding him that he wasn't alone. The song built to its final chorus, his voice rising as he sang the last lines, a promise to carry forward his father's memory, to find peace in the music, to continue playing not just for himself, but for anyone who needed hope. His voice softened, and the last note hung in the air, fading slowly into a silence so profound it was almost sacred. Jonah opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the audience. They sat motionless, some wiping away tears, others simply staring at him with expressions of quiet awe. And in that instant, he understood that he had truly shared something meaningful, something more than words or melody. He'd shared a piece of his heart, a piece of his father's spirit, and in doing so, he felt a healing warmth that he hadn't known he'd needed. As the applause began to rise, filling the room with thunderous appreciation, Jonah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He'd done it. He'd shared his music, his story. And standing there, bathed in the glow of the spotlight, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a profound, undeniable sense of peace. The applause swelled, echoing through the room as people rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces alight with admiration. Jonah sat for a moment, taking it all in, feeling the warmth of their appreciation wash over him. It was overwhelming. This sense of connection with so many people, each of them touched by the same notes that held his own pain, love, and healing. He looked toward Helen in the front row. She was on her feet, her hands clasped together, tears streaming down her cheeks as she smiled, a smile so full of pride and gratitude that it filled Jonah's heart. In that instant, he knew he hadn't just performed for himself or his father. He'd performed for Helen too, for all the moments she'd lost and for the hope they'd found together. As the applause slowly died down, Jonah rose from his stool and bowed, nodding humbly to the crowd. He felt an incredible gratitude, a deep sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just music, it was healing. For him, for Helen, and maybe even for those who'd come to listen. Making his way off stage, Jonah felt a lightness, an unburdening that surprised him. He'd carried his father's memory with him, but tonight he'd allowed it to breathe, to live through his music, and in doing so, he'd found something precious, a sense of release, a chance to let go of the past while honoring it. As he stepped into the wings, Helen was waiting for him, her eyes still shining, her arms open. Without hesitation, Jonah moved forward, and they embraced, neither of them speaking, both of them simply holding on, sharing the quiet understanding of two hearts that had found solace, connection, and perhaps most importantly, a renewed hope. As they pulled away from their embrace, Helen looked up at Jonah, her face glowing with pride and gratitude. "You did it," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "You shared something so beautiful, so honest. I knew you could." Jonah smiled, a gentle, grateful expression softening his features. "I wouldn't have done it without you, Helen. You helped me find the courage I thought I'd lost. You reminded me why music matters." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of applause and cheerful voices filling the room around them. Jonah felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years, a feeling that he'd finally let go of the burdens he'd carried, that he'd honored his father in a way that would resonate far beyond this one performance. Helen took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You know, Jonah, I think tonight you gave all of us a gift. It's rare to see someone play with such honesty, to put their heart on display like that. You showed us that music has the power to heal, to remind us of the beauty in life, even through loss." Jonah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quiet but resolute. "I want to keep doing this, playing, sharing my music. Maybe even help others who feel alone like I did." He paused, glancing at Helen. "There are so many people out there carrying grief, pain. Maybe I can help them find a bit of peace through music too." Helen's face softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Jonah. Your music, your story, it can reach so many people, and I know you'll make a difference, just like you have for me." They shared a quiet smile, understanding passing between them. That night, Jonah realized he had found not only a friend in Helen, but a purpose he hadn't dared to hope for. Together, they walked out into the cool night air, each step filled with a sense of renewal, their hearts open to the future, and to all the possibilities it held. In the weeks following the showcase, word spread about Jonah's performance, and people in the community began talking about the young man whose music had moved them so deeply. Some even reached out, asking if he would play at small local gatherings, or if he would consider teaching music to those who wanted to learn. The idea of helping others through his music stayed with Jonah, growing from a quiet thought into a purpose he couldn't ignore. One evening, as he sat with Helen in her cozy living room, he shared his new vision with her. "Helen, I want to do more with this," he said, a spark of excitement lighting his eyes. "There are so many people out there, people carrying loneliness and loss. Music helped me. Maybe I can use it to help them too." Helen's face lit up with pride, and she nodded encouragingly. "That's a beautiful idea, Jonah. I believe it's exactly what you're meant to do." Together, they began planning. With Helen's connections in the community and Jonah's newfound sense of purpose, they decided to start a series of small, intimate music sessions, open to anyone who needed a place to connect and heal. They named it the Sound of Solace, a gathering where people could come, listen to music, and share their own stories if they wished. Their first session was scheduled for a crisp November evening, not long after Thanksgiving. As they prepared, Jonah felt the familiar nerves return, but this time he found comfort in knowing he wasn't alone. Helen would be right there by his side, and they were creating something meaningful together, a place where music could bridge the gaps between people, a space for healing and hope. On the night of their first gathering, the community center was filled with a quiet warmth. People of all ages filtered in, some alone, others with friends or family, each drawn by the promise of music and connection. Helen stood by the door, welcoming each guest with a kind smile, while Jonah arranged a simple setup at the front, a small stage with his guitar, a few chairs, and soft lighting that cast a gentle glow across the room. As people took their seats, a hum of anticipation filled the air. Helen took her place in the front row, giving Jonah an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath, his hands steady on the guitar, and began with a familiar song, one he'd often played in the park. The melody was gentle, a soothing tune that seemed to ease the room into a comfortable silence. After the first song, Jonah spoke, his voice calm yet heartfelt. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Music has been a way for me to find peace, especially during difficult times. This isn't just a performance. It's a place for all of us to feel connected, to remember that we're not alone." Helen watched as people nodded, some wiping away quiet tears, others simply listening, their faces softening in understanding. The room was filled with a shared sense of vulnerability and comfort, a feeling that grew with each song Jonah played. As the evening continued, a few brave souls stood to share their own stories of loss, love, and resilience. Jonah and Helen listened, offering gentle words and songs in response, creating a tapestry of experiences woven together through music. By the end of the night, they'd created a small community, bound by the shared understanding of life's challenges and the quiet hope that had brought them all there. Over the following weeks, the Sound of Solace gatherings became a cherished tradition in the community. Word spread quickly, and each session welcomed more people, filling the room with new faces and familiar ones alike. Jonah played songs that spoke of resilience and hope, some from his own heart and others requested by those attending. His music, once a private means of coping, had become a bridge, reaching others in ways he'd never imagined. With each gathering, Jonah saw how deeply the music affected people. Some found the courage to share their stories, while others simply closed their eyes and let the melodies wash over them, offering a quiet solace that words couldn't always provide. Helen, always by his side, offered gentle encouragement, helping newcomers feel welcome and cared for. She became the heart of these sessions, a warm presence who listened to each story and reminded them all of the beauty and connection. One evening, as they packed up after a particularly moving session, Helen turned to Jonah, her eyes filled with pride. "Look at what you've created here, Jonah. You've given people a place to feel understood, to be seen." Jonah smiled, a quiet, grateful warmth filling him. "I think we created it together, Helen. Without you, I wouldn't have had the courage to even start." Helen took his hand, giving it a light squeeze. "Well, I think your father would be incredibly proud of you," she said softly. "And I am too." Jonah felt a swell of emotion, the sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be, finally honoring his father's memory in a way that mattered. The gatherings were more than music. They were a way to give back, to build a community of empathy and hope. He knew, deep in his heart, that he and Helen had created something lasting, a place where music healed, where people found comfort, and where love, even in the quietest moments, lingered long after the last note had faded. As the months passed, the Sound of Solace blossomed into more than either Jonah or Helen could have imagined. What had begun as a simple gathering of strangers seeking comfort in music had grown into a close-knit community, a place where people returned each month, not only to listen, but to connect, to share, and to find strength. Helen watched with quiet joy as friendships blossomed among the regular attendees, people who had once arrived burdened by their own grief, now sharing laughter, stories, and moments of understanding. Jonah, too, had transformed. His music had deepened, carrying a new confidence and warmth, his once private melodies now woven with the collective hope and resilience of everyone he had met. One evening, after the final song had ended and people lingered in the glow of conversation, Helen looked around the room, her heart swelling with gratitude. She realized that, in helping Jonah find his way, she, too, had found a new purpose. For the first time since her son's passing, she felt a genuine peace, a sense that her life, her presence, mattered in ways she hadn't thought possible. Jonah, noticing Helen's quiet reflection, walked over and gave her a gentle smile. "Helen," he said softly, "thank you. I could never have done this without you. You gave me back something I didn't think I'd ever find again. A family, a place to belong." Helen placed a hand over her heart, feeling the weight of his words. "And you've done the same for me, Jonah. I think, together, we've given each other a second chance." They stood there for a moment, sharing a smile that held every word left unspoken. Around them, the room buzzed with laughter and gentle conversation, a community that had become, in every way, an extended family. As they packed up to leave, Helen and Jonah walked out into the night side by side, their hearts full, knowing that the Sound of Solace would continue, carrying on their shared dream, bringing light and warmth to others for many years to come. As the year drew to a close, Helen and Jonah decided to celebrate the success of the Sound of Solace with a special end-of-year gathering. They organized an evening of music, storytelling, and a holiday meal, inviting everyone who had attended over the past months. The community center was decorated with soft lights and garlands, creating a warm, inviting glow that reflected the joy of the season. That evening, the room was packed, filled with familiar faces and new ones alike. Helen looked around, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude as she saw the laughter, the embraces, the quiet conversations taking place. It was a beautiful reminder of how far they had come, how a single act of kindness and music had blossomed into a place of belonging for so many. Jonah took the stage with his guitar, his gaze meeting Helen's across the room. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, and she returned it, her heart full. He began to play a song he'd written just for this evening, a song of gratitude, of hope, and of new beginnings. His voice was steady, his words heartfelt, and the room fell silent, captivated by the warmth of his music. As he reached the chorus, Helen felt her eyes welling with tears, touched by the beauty of the moment. She looked around, seeing others wiping their eyes, some holding hands, others simply listening, the music wrapping around them like an embrace. It was as if every person in that room was connected by an invisible thread, bound together by shared stories, by resilience, and by a profound sense of gratitude for the community they had built together. As Jonah's final note faded into the quiet, the room remained still for a moment, everyone absorbing the lingering warmth of the song. Then, as if moved by a single shared heartbeat, the audience erupted into applause, some standing, others reaching out to embrace the people beside them. Jonah's song of gratitude had touched each person in a unique way, reflecting the strength they'd found together over the past year. Jonah set down his guitar and stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion as he addressed the crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight, and for every night. This gathering, this community, it's meant more to me than I could ever put into words. Each of you has helped me heal, and I hope that in some way, the music has brought you peace, too. Helen, standing near the front, felt her heart swell with pride. Jonah looked at her then, his eyes shining with gratitude, and nodded. She stepped up beside him, joining him on stage, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. This journey started with two people carrying grief alone, Helen said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. And yet, through music, through sharing our hearts, we've all found each other. I don't think any of us could have imagined how something as simple as a song could bring us together like this. The room was filled with nods and murmurs of agreement, the audience visibly moved. Helen continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. Tonight, let's carry this feeling with us. Let's remember that even in the darkest moments, there is always light when we share them with others. Jonah placed his hand over his heart, looking out at the community that had come to mean so much to him. Thank you all, he said softly, and as he stepped down from the stage with Helen by his side, they both knew that this gathering was not just an ending, but a promise to continue to nurture this place of solace, of music, and of hope.